this is something that's not temporary. It's just you're colorblind, you're not colorblind. Well, walk into a shop for sunglasses. Look at the colors of the sunglasses. Some are gray, that's fine. These ones won't hurt your color vision that much. Some are brown, maybe hurt a little bit. Amber, blue, pink. Put those ones on. You'll become somewhat colorblind in a different way. Even colorblindness is something that happens, that can be temporary, that people can acquire and lose through those situations. So you end up with the extreme case of a user who can actually perceive color perfectly when they're in normal lighting, and when they're in bright sunlight, they lose the ability to perceive color. Color blindness, not so much for people working with screens, but people working on paper, depending on the quality of the light, of the ambient light. Ambient light that is extremely blue or extremely red can mean that you cannot perceive colors on printed paper anymore. So you also, through that environment, temporarily can become colorblind. It's a very, very complex and very deep and broad field. So now we look back at those tools that we tried to apply in the beginning, and we look at those assistive technologies. Assistive technologies is a misnomer. Every technology is assistive. Every technology that we create is here to actually assist a human, to actually do something easier, to do something better. My car that I'm going to be driving back home tonight is an assistive technology that's going to let me do 300 miles in 4 hours. It's not assistive? I mean, how could I do 300 miles in 4 hours without some technology? My phone that I've been using all day to actually chat with my wife is something that assists me stay in touch with her. All the searches I've been doing on my favorite search engine all day are just assisting me find information. So assistive technology is not just a case of saying, hey, we've built something that's pretty cool, and then we're going to sprinkle a bit of pixie dust on it so that more users can use it. That's not the way it is. As technology is assistive. And as a result, if we end up in situations where technology cannot actually assist people because of all the reasons that we've been mentioning, and technology as a whole is failing. If we build something that is meant to assist and it does not assist, then it's not working well as technology. There is no such thing as good technology that does not work for everyone all the time. It's really simple. So don't think of assistive technologies as something that as a pixie dust that you sprinkle. It's just technology. It's a fundamental part of technology. We're going to start to wrap this up. We're going to start to talk a little bit about really excellence in accessibility, which is the topic of the talk. So here's one tool that I have found personally extremely useful to actually understand accessibility. I'm lucky because I work at a company that takes these problems extremely seriously. And Yahoo has built an accessibility lab where we have 10 or so workstations, but mostly a ton of toys and gizmos that can restrict my own ability, can restrict my own senses and restrict the way I am along a lot of the dimensions that we've mentioned. And this is especially true in the domains of visual and hearing, visual and physical actually, hearing less so. It's very, very easy to make yourself really colorblind, especially for the most common kinds of colorblind, red, blue, but a lot of other things. It's really easy to actually lose the ability to see sharp. It's really easy to create tunnel vision. It's really easy to restrict your hand so that you can actually only touch one part at a time. It's really easy to restrict your hand so that it's really painful to actually go touch one aspect on the screen at a time. And once you start to actually experience those aspects for yourself, you realize some things that in retrospect look obvious, but were not obvious in the beginning. On my second slide, I was mentioning about let's make the text bigger, because obviously accessibility is about making the text bigger. Making the text smaller. Could that be accessibility? Well, actually, yes. If you've got physical difficulties in scrolling, and scrolling either the number of times you scroll or the distance that you have to scroll is actually painful, and you're going to want to actually have something that lets you scroll as little as possible and still have access to the information. So if you have physical difficulties scrolling, you're going to want to actually change your font size to be as small as you possibly can, so that you can have as much text as possible on the screen without having to scroll. So accessibility has many, many, many dimensions. I'm going to give you a process for accessibility excellence, which in fact is just a regular UI process. As we saw earlier, you try to retrofit a UI process with accessibility, it doesn't work. So let's see in terms of accessibility, hey, here's a perfect example. Because of the specific nature of this project, I'm going to try to darken my colors. This is unreadable. You've suddenly all lost your own ability to read, so I'm going to read to you. The very first bubble, the one that is the least readable here, is concept and evaluation. If at the time where you actually conceive and evaluate your early UI ideas, you do not start to ask yourself, is that going to work for everyone? Is that going to work all the time? You're going to have difficulties. So this is a step that you normally take as part of UI design. If at that step you don't already ask yourself, for everyone all the time, you're going to be missing something. Second level, you do a prototype and you actually test that prototype with yourself first and a few of the people around you. If at that point you don't ask yourself, how is that going to work for everyone? How is that going to work all the time? You've got difficulties. This is where the accessibility lab I was showing is really, really useful, because it allows you or a very small team to extremely quickly iterate on things. The third aspect, user studies. You do user studies, make sure that as you do user studies, you actually try to cover everyone, and be careful about the all the time aspect. If you do user studies purely in a lab, you're going to be missing a lot of things. You're going to be missing a lot of those temporary aspects. So I actually love to use things when I'm on the train. I actually love to use things when I'm driving, because it's very interesting. Double check as part of your pre-launch validation. Are you still working for everyone all the time? And finally, as you gather feedback, are you able to gather feedback from everyone and all the time? Do you have situations where users who might have certain difficulties, people who have certain difficulties might not be able to give you feedback to the point where you never hear about those difficulties and you'll assume that everything's fine? So just to get there, and this is going to be the conclusion or one of the conclusions, accessibility is mostly a design task. It's not an engineering task. It is not something where you can apply a list of steps that are rigidly defined that actually give you accessibility excellence. It's just design. If you retrofit accessibility on top of an existing UI, you're going to fail. That's it. There's no path to success that way. It's that simple. You have to go back to the drawing board and redesign. Finally, the most important aspect. If you design for everyone, you design UIs that work all the time, you will not need to think about accessibility as a separate task. It's going to become just a part of the way you build products. And this is the path to excellence. And now it is time for questions. Question in the audience?
I don't know if it's a question, but it's just a commentary on the whole accessibility thing. I mean, I think it's trying to design something for people who don't have full ability to make cognitive or physical interaction with the app is maybe designed by a fully trans person. But I think the one that I see a lot these days, even among people who are more capable, is the inattention. That sort of falls in the same line. How do you build an app so that people can use it without really having to pay attention to it?
That's a great question. The question I'm going to repeat briefly is how do we deal with people who actually have inattention? And that goes back to the aspect that I was mentioning, which is the combination of situational and cognitive. What you're really describing is people who put themselves in situations where they lose their cognitive ability to actually pay attention to something. It is really tricky because in order to let people lose attention and come back to an application, you have to have essentially the full context of what might be interesting to them available to them whenever they come back. But obviously, the full context could be so complex, so overwhelming that you that you would run against the goal of presenting information in a simple way. So a lot of work that happens around attention and those cognitive aspects goes back to visual imagery. That's a very interesting thing because icons, colors, can actually let you specify extremely quickly what a certain aspect is about. I'm going to take a good example, and it's an example that doesn't make me look good, so hey, I'm not too self-promoting here. I grew up in France, actually I follow French soccer. When I get a notification about soccer in Yahoo Sports, I actually get a generic Yahoo Sports icon as my notification, which means I need to open it and figure out what sports that is. And then there are 3-letter acronyms that actually, or 3-letter abbreviations for each team. If I get one from Google now, I actually get the icon of a soccer ball, and I get the full name of each team. It takes me a lot less cognitive effort, without any context whatsoever, to know what the notification is when it's coming from Google now than when it is when it's coming from Yahoo Sports. So I know we still have a lot of work to do there. A lot of that is really that aspect, just getting quickly to the point and giving the user the right information so that they can actually have the full context at a glance or within their attention time span. Yes?
So, in the first part of the last conclusion, you're saying design for everyone. Well, that almost seems asymptotic because everyone, as you said earlier today, is different, and everyone will have different issues of accessibility. So, I mean, the vector space, that use case, vector space really becomes close to infinite. So, you see what I'm saying? You can design for 99% of all users, the use cases for all those users and their accessibility issues. But, I mean, how far and how long and how hard do you go at this? You see what I'm saying?
Yes, so the question is really how to design for everyone, I would say, upfront versus how to do it in a way that's going to be asymptotic. Obviously, in the context of a slide deck and a presentation, I had to actually simplify a lot of things. There is some truth in what you're saying, but there are also some aspects that are important to think about upfront. So I'm going to give you an aspect that's a real-world example that we hit at Yahoo with Yahoo Mail. We designed initially more for people who had good visual abilities, and then we started to retrofit for fully blind users who would have to use a screen reader. And we had built a wonderful feature where when you receive an email where the subject is longer than one line, we would actually truncate the subject. And when we naively retrofitted a screen reader onto that, we would only read the truncated version of the text because it was on screen, as opposed to just reading a longer part of the subject. Because for a blind user, there is not fundamentally a limit that comes from the screen size. In fact, users who are fully blind tend to actually use devices with smaller screens, because for them the screen is just an input surface, it's not an output surface. So there's a certain aspect here about, as an example, if you design too much too early for a certain category of users, the risk that you have is that as you expand your user base to more users, you're just going to take subsets of what you've already built and make those subsets available to more users, more users, more users. So there's a certain risk that as you try to get asymptotically to more users, you're going to get asymptotically to being useless. And in order to actually have full usability for everyone, while you might not necessarily build the features on day one, having that awareness in the back of your head that those features will matter becomes important. There's a wonderful one, and if you read WCAG, you become aware of those problems. More and more those days we're actually putting videos everywhere. And more those days we're getting videos to autoplay everywhere. And then there's a horrible mistake you can make, which is to actually autoplay the sound as well. If your user is using a screen reader and they already rely on sound to navigate their UI and to understand what's going on, in the middle of nowhere, as they're scrolling down the screen, something's going to start to play. That's going to bother them. But even worse, it's literally for that one user a denial service because they cannot figure out anymore how to stop how to actually stop that audio, because they cannot hear the cues themselves that will tell them that they're already there. So very early, if you start to think about, I'm going to build video and I'm going to build autoplay into videos, if you don't start to ask yourself what is going to be the impact of that fundamental feature for users who are on the screen reader, it's going to be much harder later down the road. Or maybe you have the business relationships, maybe you've got the product relationship, maybe you've done a lot of things around that feature, and you realize that there's absolutely no way whatsoever to suddenly make that feature work for a user on the screen reader. And while you might not have built absolutely everything about accessibility, you'll come back to it. Let me give you another example, because it's another one that's based on video. It's a very interesting one. We love to build those video players that actually show you the video, especially full screen, and after a few seconds, all the controls on the video disappear. If you're with a screen reader, it might take you more than 5 seconds to actually figure out how to change the settings on that video. If the settings disappear after less than 5 seconds, if it takes you more time to just navigate the settings, navigate that navigation bar, then the navigation bar survives on screen, then you've got difficulty. So you've got to assume, as you're building that video player very early, that the navigation bar is not something you'll be able to leave on screen for 1 or 2 seconds. You have to assume that it might have to stay on screen for much, much, much longer. And it's, by the way, it's not just for people with screen readers. Just like I was mentioning, physical ability, if you have tremors, you might have a very hard time hitting a specific button on the screen. If by the time you manage to hit the button is gone, that becomes a horrible experience. So even as you don't build all of those features, and even as you don't cover all of those cases in terms of technology, being aware of them very early will build into your product the potential for being excellent once you hit the 99%, and will give you the ability to give all of those users an excellent experience as you're just building up your product, as opposed to cornering yourself into a situation where you will have to degrade the experience as you're trying to add more and more users. And you will be building better and better products, like I said, for everyone, but also all the time. I was giving the example of riding BART. I was giving it from the point of view of noise, but it's something that you can probably relate in many kind of public transit. If you're dealing with any sensitive confidential information, and you're in public transit, you can't actually access that information on the screen. Because anybody around you, chances are, might actually see it, especially on the smartphones where we don't have privacy screens. Occasionally I have to do that when I'm riding public transit. What do? Headphones, talk back, and actually use the user interface that was designed for blind users. Because really fundamentally what has happened is that for confidential information, I have to make myself blind. And I have to make myself unable to see it because somebody else might see it. And as a result, I've become pretty good at actually using all those assistive technologies, screen readers, because I've realized that there are times when for hours at a time I'm blind because I'm in public transit and I can't show things on my screen. And those aspects happen all the time. I mean, for me personally, now that I've become aware of those things, I just keep finding those examples where I have those difficulties using technology. A week ago, I was lucky to be skiing. It was cold. I had 2 pairs of gloves. Try to use a touchscreen with 2 pairs of gloves. It's not going to work. And I was up there at 10,000 feet in bright sun. It was wonderful. But bright sun, very thick sunglasses, even with the brightness at the maximum on my smartphone, I could barely read it. Because I wasn't quite blind, but I had lost the ability to read quite as much. And those situations really happen all the time. All the time. Tonight, at around midnight, I can tell you my cognitive abilities aren't going to be so sharp anymore. Even with caffeine, it's not going to be wonderful. I'm going to get back home, and if my wife tries to talk to me while I'm reading something, I'm going to lose my train of thought. Something's going to give. So, as you build those technologies, it's not just a fraction of the population who might be included or excluded by the way you approach things. It's also users who might want to actually, who usually would have the ability to use your application, but for some reason who are temporarily losing that ability to use your application. And as you're building your application with more and more of those dimensions, as you take more and more of those dimensions into account, you will build applications that work for all of those users, again, all the time. And given a choice between an application that, once you get used to it, that you can use all the time, and one where you have to wait a few hours until you can use it again, the one that you can use all the time is actually pretty good. Again, we're talking about issues of attention a few seconds ago. We're not used anymore to just telling ourselves, oh, in 3 hours when I get home, I need to do that. No, we just want to do it right here, right now. So that's my approach, and that's why to me it's important to build that up front. Is that you build all the foundation, all the technologies to really build something that's going to work, it's going to make much better products. As an industry, we're not very good there yet, which is a curse and a blessing. It's a curse because we don't have very strong role models to look at. It's a blessing because as soon as you do a good job, it's a land grab. You're going to rush ahead of everybody else and gain an advantage.